The Anarchist Prophets, Part 3. Godwin on Property and Max Stirner. The Anarchist Prophets, Part 3. Godwin on Property and Max Stirner. Godwin's attitude towards property is, in some ways, even more extreme than what one will find in the classical continental anarchist, Kropotkin perhaps excepted. In matters of material goods, Godwin was a proto-socialist, and a radical one at that. Those who have more than they actually need have a positive duty in justice, not just in charity, to support those who don't. Godwin's conception of justice is rather positive than negative. Justice is not merely a matter of non-aggression or non-interference, as it is for a libertarian, but is rather a positive matter of rendering assistance to others who need it. Anticipating themes that will later find expression in John Rawls, Godwin believes that what we have, and indeed what we are, we hold in a kind of trust for the use and benefit of all. Godwin believes that all men are entitled to a share of the common stock of human possessions, not only so much as will keep him in being, but such as will provide for his well-being. There is, however, a corresponding duty on all to perform their share of the common tasks. The dominant image here is agrarian, of happy peasants working together in the field. Godwin shares the bucolic romanticism that is common to many other anarchists, and like all romantics, he has reservations about the ultimate value of industrialism. Godwin is not alone in being attached to this romantic image. We find the same thing in Thomas More and Winstanley and in Kropotkin. Such a communal life requires a wholesale simplification of our needs and the elimination of luxury. The accumulation of property is inimical to such a simple life. Of life in such a simple, non-industrial community, Godwin tells us a story that will become standard for all utopian thinkers. Such an idyllic life would require a minimum of labour, leaving the maximum of our time and energy for other pursuits. The same story would be told again by Marx, and it is perhaps worth repeating it in outline once again. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels write that as soon as the division of labour comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity which is forced upon him, and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critic, and must remain so if he doesn't want to lose his means of livelihood. And of course, the division of labour is most highly developed in industrial societies. However, in a communist society, on the other hand, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. This fantasy is repeated by others, including Kropotkin. If we abandon luxury, the need for most of the work in which we currently engage will disappear. Such work as is needed will not be a great strain on anyone. If superfluity were banished, the necessity for the greater part of the manual industry of mankind would be superseded, and the rest being amicably shared among all the active and vigorous members of the community would be burdensome to none. Every man would have a frugal yet wholesome diet. All would have leisure to cultivate the kindly and philanthropical affections of the soul and to let loose his faculties in the search of intellectual improvement, writes Godwin. But what if I wish to acquire and retain property? Is it not mine, provided I have not acquired it by force or by fraud? Godwin is willing to concede that your property is indeed yours, but only in the sense that it is a trust which I am obliged to use for the increase of liberty, knowledge, and virtue. In giving to another from what is mine, I do him no favours, but merely discharge an obligation. What if a man will say that he came honestly by his wealth, that he owes no debts and may dispose of his wealth as he pleases? Godwin rejects this argument completely. If justice have any meaning, Nothing can be more iniquitous than for one man to possess superfluities, while there is a human being in existence that is not adequately supplied with these. Godwin considers the objection, often repeated since his time, that a system of equal property would lead to sloth. A critic might urge, once establish it as a principle in society that no man is to apply to his personal use more than his necessities require, and you will find every man become indifferent to those exertions which now call forth the energy of his faculties. If each man found that, without being compelled to exert his own industry, he might lay claim to the superfluity of his neighbour, indolence would perpetually usurp his faculties, and such a society must either starve or be obliged in its own defence to return to that system of injustice and sordid interest. Godwin replies to this objection that his proposal is to take hold only after we have experienced great intellectual improvement, and in such circumstances men will not relapse into indolence merely because of the equality of property. Well, perhaps he's right in making such a claim, perhaps not. Who can tell? In any event, our disposition of society must concern itself with men as they are, not with men as they might become, and that renders Godwin's proposals moot in the extreme. As the Irish proverb has it, live horse and get grass. Moreover, continues Godwin, just how much work would be required to produce what we need? He has already suggested that most manual labour would become unnecessary in his brave new world. He now goes on to specify that the actual amount of work required of any man would be of so light a burthen as to assume the appearance of agreeable relaxation and gentle exercise than of labour. How long would we have to work to produce our necessities? Godwin answers, half an hour a day, seriously employed in manual labour by every member of the community, would sufficiently supply the whole necessaries. Who is there that would shrink from this degree of industry? This recurrent fantasy is not more persuasive on its second appearance than it was on its first. All in all, I hope I may be forgiven if I say that I find Godwin's reply to the indolence objection to be less than persuasive, requiring, as it does, a reformation of human nature and a blithe romantic misunderstanding of the relationship between human needs and human productivity. Despite his affinities with anarcho-collectivists and anarcho-communists in this matter of property, Godwin, like Stirner and Proudhon, is a staunch individualist and detests all forms of collectivism. He is deeply suspicious of any form of cooperation which might become institutionalized. Despite rejecting the anarchist label, William Godwin has a strong claim to be considered the first explicitly reflective anarchist thinker. He characterizes government as a source of evil and is prepared to accept it as, at best, a necessary evil in mankind's current state of development. His approach to ethics is essentially utilitarian, while his attitude to property is reflected subsequently in such thinkers as Henry George and the contemporary left libertarians Michael Otsuka and Peter Valentine. Max Stirner. In the history of anarchism, Max Stirner, born Johann Caspar Schmidt, stands alone, and that is just as it should be. For a more radical individualist thinker can scarcely be found. If Godwin's political justice was a supernova that blazed for a brief moment before dying as spectacularly as it had blazed, Stirner's book, The Ego in His Own, had a similarly striking and brief moment of astronomical glory. What is striking about The Ego and His Own is not that it had its Warholian 15 minutes of fame, but that it had any minute of fame at all. As anyone who has tried to read it will know, it is a disorganized, rhapsodic effusion that induces a kind of intellectual vertigo in the reader. Much ore surrounding some few nuggets of gold. It is not a little ironic that Stirner himself notes, what has here been set down roughly, summarily, and doubtless as yet incomprehensibly, will, it is to be hoped, become clearer as we go on. The reader will have to be the judge of whether Stirner's hopes have been realized. Stirner anticipates many themes that would become familiar years later with Nietzsche, and, in another mode with Ayn Rand. But unlike Nietzsche and Rand, Stirner would not go on to achieve any measure of permanent fame. In an ironic twist of fate, Nietzsche, in fact, would be one of the few to recognize the power and potential of Stirner's thought. In the late 19th century, there was a temporary revival of interest in Stirner. Benjamin Tucker published the first English edition of The Ego and His Own. Godwin, like the 18th century man he was, put his trust in reason, but Stirner violently and passionately rejects reason and all its works and pomps. In so doing, he became one of the earliest of the modern irrationalists. In contrast to Godwin's stress on reason, Stirner speaks for the will and the instincts, and he seeks to cut through all the structures of myth and philosophy, all the artificial constructions of human thought, to the elemental self, writes George Woodcock. The individual is what we know, and it is the only thing we know. And recalling medieval metaphysical nominalism, each individual is absolutely unique. Many anarchist thinkers have an operative principle, justice or reason or mutual aid, which supervenes on the tendency towards the atomistic fragmentation that anarchism is believed to encourage. Stirner has nothing like this, and wants nothing like this. He denies the existence of natural law. He denies the very idea of a common humanity. His ideal is the egoist, a bare individual set over against all collectivities and indeed other individuals. Each ego is a law unto itself. There are no rights, no duties, no immutable moral laws. The self does not demand any right, nor does it recognize any. In a surprising twist, even freedom, which is normally the desideratum of libertarians everywhere, is subordinated to the uniqueness of the ego. Stirner rejects any and every restriction on the individual: religion, state, society, principles and parties. Even the abstract noun man came in for criticism. Each ego retreats into itself, like a political version of Leibniz's monads, and in this moment of retreat, the possibility or likelihood of conflict recedes. Egos can associate in Stirner's world, but they do so spontaneously, and only for as long as, and to the extent that they wish to do so. A bizarre form of association indeed. Stirner approaches a kind of nihilism in his rejection of all absolutes. The state cannot exist without the ascendancy of one man over another, and that is fundamentally incompatible with Stirner's idea of the ego. The state, the apotheosis of collective man, necessarily imperils freedom, and so must be destroyed. The state, Stirner writes, always has the sole purpose to limit, tame, subordinate the individual, to make him subject to some generality or other. It lasts only so long as the individual is not all in all, and it is only the clearly marked restriction of me, my limitation, my slavery. But apart from the state, other people can also set themselves up as an obstacle to my freedom. Existence may then be, as for Hobbes, a war of each against all. Anarchists commonly distinguish between the state and society, opposing the former while valorizing the latter. Stirner's egoism leads him to reject both state and society. Therefore, we too, the state and I, are enemies. I, the egoist, have not at heart the welfare of this human society. I sacrifice nothing to it. I only utilize it. But to be able to utilize it completely, I transform it rather into my property and my creature. That is, I annihilate it, and form in its place the union of egoists. Any absolute, not only the state and society, constitutes an obstacle to my ego. The ego cannot recognize anything as superior to itself. What is sacred to me is not my own. In saying this, Stirner opposes all sacred or quasi-sacred entities: church, state, society, man, morality, that can be set over against the individual. The individual cannot be subsumed in any of these quasi-sacred collectivities. Everything sacred, he says, is the tie, a fetter. Stirner has no time for those who reject Christianity, but hold on to a morality that is every bit as dominating. The same people, he says, who oppose Christianity as the basis of the state, who oppose the so-called Christian state, do not tire of repeating that morality is the fundamental pillar of social life and of the state. As if the dominion of morality were not a complete dominion of the sacred, a hierarchy. Freedom, the foundational principle of libertarianism, is contrasted unfavourably with what Stirner calls ownness. What a difference, he remarks, between freedom and ownness. One can get rid of a great many things, one yet does not get rid of all. One becomes free from much, not from everything. Inwardly, one may be free in spite of the condition of slavery, although, too, it is again only from all sorts of things, not from everything. But from the whip, the domineering temper of the master, one does not as slave become free. Freedom lives only in the realm of dreams. Ownness, on the contrary, is my whole being and existence. It is I myself. I am free from what I am rid of, owner of what I have in my power or what I control. My own I am at all times and under all circumstances, if I know how to have myself and do not throw myself away on others. To be free is something that I cannot truly will, because I cannot make it, cannot create it. I can only wish it and aspire towards it, for it remains an ideal, a spook. The fetters of reality cut the sharpest welts in my flesh every moment, but my own I remain. It goes without saying that Stirner rejects idealism or altruism. These are idols of our own construction, which serve to obscure ourselves from ourselves. Even the search for freedom can be itself another idol. Thousands of years of civilization, he says, have obscured to you what you are, have made you believe you are not egoists but are called to be idealists, good men. Shake that off. Do not seek for freedom, which does precisely deprive you of yourselves, in self-denial, but seek for yourselves, become egoists, become each of you an almighty ego. Stirner will have no truck with the idea of our having duties or, like Godwin, having natural rights. I do not demand any right, therefore I need not recognize any either. What I can get by force, I get by force, and what I do not get by force, I have no right to. Nor do I give myself airs or consolation with my imprescriptible right. Also like Godwin, Stirner accepts that the consequence of this rejection of rights implies that a man may do as he pleases, not only with himself and his own, but also with the self of others. I secure my freedom, he says, with regard to the world, in the degree that I make the world my own. Gain it and take possession of it for myself, by whatever might, by that of persuasion or petition or categorical demand, yes, even by hypocrisy, cheating, etc. This amoralism has consequences for Stirner's account of property. He writes, "The communists affirm that the earth belongs rightfully to him who tills it, and its products to those who bring them out. I think it belongs to him who knows how to take it, or who does not let it be taken from him, does not let himself be deprived of it. If he appropriates it, then not only the earth, but the right to it too belongs to him. This is egoistic right. It is right for me, therefore it is right." Property and power go hand in hand. "What then is my property?" he writes. "Nothing but what is in my power. To what property am I entitled? To every property to which I empower myself. I give myself the right of property in taking property to myself, or giving myself the proprietor's power, full power, empowerment." Stirner notes neatly that Proudhon's claim that property is theft is in fact a left-handed affirmation of property. Is the concept of theft at all possible, he asks, unless one allows validity to the concept of property? How can one steal if property is not already extant? What belongs to no one cannot be stolen. The water that one draws out of the sea, he does not steal. Accordingly, property is not theft, but the theft becomes possible only through property. Max Stirner is the most radical of radical thinkers. His egoistic individualism is the most extreme form of individualism to be found in all the thinkers that we have or will consider. He was the first to adumbrate themes that would subsequently find a more prominent home in thinkers such as Nietzsche and Ayn Rand. He rejected reason, natural law, rights, duties, all absolutes, even a common humanity. Even freedom was less important to him than the radical uniqueness of the ego. It hardly needs to be said that he rejects the state. Summary. At the heart of the idea of anarchy lies a deep-rooted resistance to having one's life and actions ordered by others. Anarchy has the root meaning of absence of leadership or absence of government, with, in its popular signification, the additional idea of lawlessness or disorder resulting from that absence. It can also mean a state of society without government, but without any implication that the absence of government and presence of liberty spells disorder. The topic that fundamentally separates anarchists into different types is their approach to property. Individualist anarchists, and also, as we shall see, Proudhonian mutualists, tend to regard property, properly conceived, as a guarantor of freedom and non-dominance. Collectivist and communist anarchists, on the other hand, tend to reject the notion of property out of hand. Some consider Godwin to be the first philosophical anarchist. The vindication of this claim lies in Godwin's authorship of An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. Godwin believed that the character of human beings is completely determined by their social environments. Godwin retains an Enlightenment faith, one can only describe it as faith, in the power of reason, promoted by education, to govern human life, and foresees the eventual disappearance of any need for force and hence any need for government. Godwin doesn't believe that men have rights. He is a proto-utilitarian and thinks that what we tend to regard as rights, freedom of speech or conscience, are simply devices we need to help us find our way to moral truth. The basis of human society is our need for mutual assistance. Society is possible only on the basis of justice, which is the rule or rules emerging from and permitting the connection of one person with another. Since human beings are one and all morally equally to another, if they come together with one another, it can only be because they believe that this will be productive of their mutual advantage. Godwin believes government to be an evil, albeit a necessary evil in present circumstances. In time, it will not be necessary. In the meantime, a kind of radically decentralized democracy would be an acceptable second best. Governments are responsible for many of the evils that afflict society. Godwin believes that all men are entitled to a share of the common stock of human possessions, not only so much as will keep him in being, but such as would provide for his well-being. There is, however, a corresponding duty on all to perform their share of the common tasks. A more radical individualist thinker than Max Stirner is unlikely to be found. Stirner anticipates many themes that will become familiar years later with Nietzsche and, in another mode, with Ayn Rand. But unlike Nietzsche and Rand, Stirner would not go on to achieve any measure of permanent fame. In an ironic twist of fate, Nietzsche, in fact, would be one of the few to recognize the power and potential of Stirner's thought. In the late 19th century, there was a temporary revival of interest in Stirner. Benjamin Tucker published the first English edition of The Ego and His Own. Godwin, like the 18th century man he was, put his trust in reason, but Stirner violently and passionately rejects reason and all its works and pomps. Many anarchist thinkers have an operative principle, justice or reason or mutual aid, which supervenes on the tendency towards the atomistic fragmentation that anarchism is believed to encourage. Stirner has nothing like this and wants nothing like this. He denies the existence of natural law. He denies the very idea of a common humanity. His ideal is the egoist, a bare individual set over against all collectivities and indeed other individuals. Each ego is a law unto itself. There are no rights, no duties, no immutable moral laws. The self does not demand any right, nor does it recognize any. In a surprising twist, even freedom, which is normally the desideratum of libertarians everywhere, is subordinated to the uniqueness of the ego. Stirner approaches a kind of nihilism in his rejection of all absolutes. The state cannot exist without the ascendancy of one man over another, and that is fundamentally incompatible with Stirner's idea of the ego. The state, the apotheosis of collective man, necessarily imperils freedom, and so must be destroyed. Freedom, the foundational principle of libertarianism, is contrasted unfavourably with what Stirner calls ownness. Stirner will have no truck with the idea of our having duties, or, like Godwin, having natural rights. He accepts that the consequences of this rejection of rights implies that a man may do as he pleases, not only with himself and his own, but also with the self of others.